About Time, an extract from the anthology Ultimate Shades of Horror by John Wing. Michael Wells strapped on a balaclava over his head. He then gently picked up an armband that rested on the table next to him. He wrapped it around his wrist, clasping it closed with a firm click. A 3-inch screen was fixed on the leather band. He pressed a small silver button, causing the LED display to come to life. 3 words leapt out at him from the bright screen: date, time, and location. He raised his head, staring into space, pondering on what he should do. Here he was, on the dawn of new possibilities for mankind, deliberating whether he should enter the required data. After all, he didn't know what would really happen. He'd seen films on time travel, such as Back to the Future and the Butterfly Effect, read books on the topic such as The Time Machine, The Time Traveller's Wife, Behold the Man, and The Clock That Went Backward. But they were just works of fiction, inspiring and wondrous, but written by people who had let their fancies get the better of them. He, Michael Wells, was about to do it for real. Who knew what the consequences would be? He may die, become seriously ill, or even hideously disfigured like Jeff Goldblum's character in the film The Fly. But without risk, there would be no possibility of gain. It would be worth it, no matter the outcome. He read papers by eminent scientists such as Professor Hawking and Cox. Professor Brian Cox admitted in 2013 at the British Science Festival that time travel was possible, but only if you want to go to the future and not come back again. He explained that time travel had already taken place, but on a very small scale. The closer someone travels to the speed of light, the more time slows. Cox reasoned if time slows to a significant amount, it could transport that person thousands of years into the future. Michael knew, though, that Einstein's theory of relativity suggested otherwise, in that it may be feasible to travel backwards in time by following a space-time path that doubles back and returns to its own starting point in space, but at an earlier time. Michael also remembered an article that appeared in the Daily Mail where Stephen Hawking had said, "Time travel movies often feature a vast, energy-hungry machine. The machine creates a path through the 4th dimension, a tunnel through time. A time traveller, a brave, perhaps foolhardy individual, prepared for who knows what, steps into the time tunnel and emerges who knows when. The concept may be far-fetched, and the reality may be very different from this, but the idea itself is not so crazy." He was about to find it if it was crazy, foolhardy, or perhaps both. He entered the information in by tapping the touch-sensitive glass. He decided it best not to travel too far into the future. Here goes nothing. Michael pressed another slightly larger button than the first one. He had no idea what would happen next. He stood there in the basement. Nothing happened. The clock on the wall to his right carried on ticking. The lamp on his desk continued to shine, and his laptop showed the same static picture of the Bristol suspension bridge he had taken a few years back. A whole minute had gone by. Nothing. He had failed. As he was about to remove the balaclava, something changed. Did the light seem less bright? Did the ticking clock seem less intrusive? He stared at the photograph of his mother and father that had been taken 30 years ago at Scarborough, the last time he had visited the holiday resort. It was blurred. He looked all about him. Everything was blurred. Then the desk lamp extinguished itself. Everything became dark and cold. He wore a long grey overcoat over his woolen blue jumper and thick gloves including insulated trousers for this eventuality. His breathing became difficult. The overwhelming darkness was like floating in space. He couldn't see a damn thing, but he could still tell his feet stood on the solid floor. Suddenly, there was a jolt, as if a bus he was travelling on came to an abrupt halt. He stumbled backwards, but didn't fall. A burst of bright light erupted all about him and as quickly dissipated. Michael opened his eyes that he had closed momentarily shut before when the fierce light had exploded all about him. It had worked. By God, it had worked. He couldn't believe it. He had done the impossible. He had travelled forward in time. By only 3 days, admittedly. But he had done it. Yes, he shouted. He was stood where he hoped to be, on the Downs in Bristol, on a Saturday morning at precisely 11 a.m, 2 miles from his house. He had chosen this spot because every Saturday about this time he always went out for a jog. Hopefully, he would see himself running by within the next 20 minutes or so. A dog barked up at him. He gazed down at the animal. It wouldn't stop yapping at him. He then realised that he must look so out of place. He removed the mask and gloves, hurriedly stuffing them into his coat pockets. The black terrier still wouldn't let up until its owner, a tall, thin woman in her 30s, shouted his name, but he ignored her. She was forced to pick him up, giving Michael a strange glance as she did so, marching off with him in the distance. He took in his surroundings more closely. There were quite a few people on this wide open space, either out for a morning run or stroll, walking their dogs, or, as he noticed a few hundred feet from him, some youngsters playing football, all surrounded by the road in the distance, where traffic constantly went to and fro. The sky was an inviting blue, with only a few clouds to mar its rays. Standing there, in several layers of clothing, he was aware of sweat pouring down his skin. Then he saw himself running along the pavement by the edge of the grass, some 30 feet away, in blue shorts, white trainers and a white top. He waved to him. Michael diffidently waved back. He was waving to himself. How bizarre, he thought. But of course, his future self would know that he would be standing there. He just gawped at himself as he ran further into the distance until he could see him no more. He, Michael Wells, was the first man to time travel. He would have to write all this down. He would have to do a lot of writing and a lot more experiments. His next test would be to travel back in time. After a few attempts, and if nothing went wrong, he would then confide in his best friend. And although he wanted to share his success immediately, he realised he had to err on the side of caution. He set his LED display to exactly the same time he had jaunted from on that wet Wednesday night, and donned his gloves, slipping the balaclava over his face. He could barely contain himself when he returned to the present day. His joy was that of a 5-year-old on Christmas morning. He had to celebrate this momentous event. There was a small wine rack at the back of the basement. He rushed over to it, extracting a bottle he had saved for such an occasion. He uncorked it and poured a decent quantity into his white mug on the table. He held it up. To Michael Wells, the first man to time travel. He gulped a good portion of it down, then sat at his desk and, using his laptop, made an entry under the heading of today's date, detailing what he had achieved and how he had done it, describing his first jaunt to the future. Satisfied all was officially confirmed, he stared at his words. He had to do more. He was on such a high. No way could he go to sleep. He had to do it again, immediately. But this time, he had to travel into the past, and he knew exactly when. His mood became sombre. His heart weighed heavy. He had never forgotten her, and he never would. At last now, he could see her again. Even though it would cause him a lot of pain, he knew he had to see her again. be it from a distance. His love for her had never diminished. Even though he wouldn't be able to speak to her, or touch her, or smell her intoxicating fragrance, at least he could be near her again. Michael prepared himself. This time he decided to sit in his chair by the desk. The wall clock showed 1:15 in the morning. It was Thursday already. He entered the date, time and location. Again, he wasn't sure what was going to happen, because this time he was travelling 15 years into the past to when he was 32. He pressed the larger button. He sat there, quietly but in trepidation, his heart beating erratically as images of her floated in and out of his mind. Then it began. Everything went blurred, followed by complete darkness. But this time the room seemed to be shuddering. He heard something crash to the floor, but couldn't tell what it was. The sound of breaking glass sounded in his ears as everything about him seemed to shake and vibrate, until he was jolted in his chair, more violently than the first time, toppling backwards, coming to land on the floor with a heavy thud, hitting his head in the process. It all abruptly stopped, with a blinding, glaring flash of white, piercing light. If you're intrigued how this story continues, it is available to download from Amazon in my anthology, Ultimate Shades of Horror.